So much. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to take moderator's prerogative task, something that I've wanted to know for a long time. What's your earliest memory of each other? And then we'll get into the substantive stuff.
Talk about personal questions. Steve, we've known each other since high school. We went to Van Nuys High. So did John Postel, by the way, for people who know about the early stages of the net. What's your earliest recollection?
So we met in fall of '59, I think. 1959, I should say.
1859,
yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I think it was German class, but I can't be sure.
Frau Fürst, yeah?
Yeah.
I remember
her. But we hung out a lot, and so a lot of things were going on. We created a math club, and we were doing other kinds of things.
Steve showed his leadership very early on. There wasn't a math club, so he invented one. And we competed fairly successfully in Los Angeles for the years that we were still in high school together.
Actually, the creation of that math club is relevant to the proceedings here today for the following reason. So I arrived at Van Nuys High and was horrified to find that there was no math club. And so I went off to see what it took to start one. 5 of us, Vint and I and 3 other boys, got together and we created a math club. And then somebody got the bright idea that we needed a constitution. All progress stopped. We spent an entire year trying to write a constitution for the 5 of us for a club. We got no math done at all. Seriously. And that experience has stayed with me in terms of the need for getting work done and organizing as needed rather than saying, well, you can't do anything until we have a framework and then we have to discuss all the principles and so forth. And it really has, in fact, colored and informed my orientation toward governance in various structures. Meanwhile, we go to class and study about the Constitution and how a bill becomes a law and about the 3 branches of government and so forth. And so there's these 2 extremes. And it's been really quite fascinating watching those forces play out in the ICANN environment, in the internet environment, in the IETF, where I was very active for a long time, and many other structures.
Excellent. I'm sorry. And in my excitement, I completely failed at my most basic duties. Steve Crocker is the chairman of the board.
No, he's
that part I got. Steve Crocker is the chairman of the board of ICANN, and Vinton Cerf is chief internet evangelist for Google, and both are present and integrally involved at the creation of the internet. So how well? So that was 1959. You said was the sort of first meeting point.
I think that's right.
Okay, so it's been 60 years plus. How well is the internet doing?
How well is the internet doing? So it's doing what it was supposed to do, which was to continue to expand, to get more people online, to increase the total capacity to provide products and services. I think it's still a very open environment. There's a lot of pressure to make it less open, and there are reasons for that, and that influences some of the debates and discussions about internet governance. I think I'd like to draw your attention to what I consider to be a fact, which is that the term internet governance is not about IANA, and it's not about ICANN exclusively. It's a much broader question. What do people do on the internet? And because the general public is involved, some of the general public doesn't have your best interest at heart. And so we have people who do harmful things on the net. This issue is made more complicated by the fact that the network goes everywhere, and therefore the perpetrators of harm can be in one jurisdiction and the victims in another. This leads to all kinds of complexity, especially if there are international boundaries in between. So I think that on the whole, the internet is fulfilling a promise that I and Bob Kahn and Steve and others hoped, which is that it would continue to supply opportunity for new applications. I think the most interesting thing about the internet now is that the mobiles, especially smartphones and the higher speeds in the radio domain, have made it even more useful than it was before because it's so accessible. But now we have the head scratcher, which is how to protect people from harm while at the same time protecting their freedom of expression and freedom of access to information.
I agree with all of that. Vince talked about the large picture, and we've seen this, and I have had this kind of special privilege of being in it from a very beginning and having actually reasonably good vision about many of the things, not everything, but many of the things that would come forth. Nonetheless, there are some surprises along the way. I worked on a lot of the technical aspects and can tell you at length, bore you to death with some of the early stories and so forth. But recently, my daughter delivered to us a grandson, and it's caused me to see the internet in an entirely different way. I have to say, I really didn't get it, but FaceTime is what it's all about. Watching our baby grandson day by day, more often, actually 2, 3, 4 times a day. That's all my wife does. So that's what the internet's all about. But seriously, it's had a huge impact personally and on each of us as well as globally, totally transformative. So it's doing pretty well. It's easy to pick off the pieces that are negatives. There's all kinds of crime and other ills. But I think the real problem there is simply that people are involved. If we could get the people out of the system, then we wouldn't have any of those problems.
So I do have one other data point. Some of you will know that we ran out of IP version 4 address space, at least at the IANA level, in February of 2011. So it's now 4.5 years later. Now all of the regional internet registries have essentially run out of their available supply of 32-bit version 4 address space. We standardized IP version 6, 128-bit address space, way back around 1996. And many of us, including me, thought that it would be instantly obvious that you would want to implement the larger address space to avoid any serious problems in the future. And that didn't happen. It's kind of like the guy that has a hole in his roof and he doesn't fix it when it's raining because it's too dangerous, and when it's not raining, he doesn't bother because it's not causing a problem. So the good news is that there is some significant indication of implementation of IPv6. It's a little early to say we've hit the knee of some kind of a hockey stick curve, but I am now more positive about it than I have been in the last 19 years or so. So I'm hoping that we'll see those numbers increase. Mobiles and the Internet of Things may accelerate the adoption of IPv6. That doesn't solve all the world's problems by any means, but it would certainly eliminate one source of pressure and complexity because the use of network address translation leads to all kinds of brittle side effects. So anyway, I think that's a good news status on one part of the Internet.
Okay. In those early days, internet governance was pretty much a few folks in a room making decisions for how this was all going to work. Was there a vision for how it would scale?
You asked whether there was a vision or a hallucination, which is which. Well, you might find it amusing to go through the thought process that led to the 32-bit address space. This is way back in 1973. Bob and I are starting to write the first documents about internet design, and we had just demonstrated the ARPANET publicly here in Washington at the Washington Hilton Hotel, very successfully, I would say. So we're sitting here thinking, okay, we're trying to build this thing with multiple networks. So how many networks will there be per country? And we thought, well, it wasn't exactly inexpensive to build a national scale network. So we thought, well, maybe there will be 2 per country, so there'll be some competition. And then we wondered, how many countries are there? We didn't have any Google to ask at the time. So we guessed at 128 because that was a power of 2, and that's what programmers think in. So 2 times 128 is 256. It takes 8 bits to represent 256 networks. And then we said, how many computers will there be per network? And in those years, the kind of computers that were around were big, giant things that had to be run in air-conditioned rooms, and they were time-shared, and they served anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 people. So we said, okay, well, let's go crazy. How about 16 million machines per network, which is 24 bits? So that's how we ended up with the 32-bit address space. When you do the math, it's 4.3 billion terminations. And at the time, we thought, surely that's enough to do this experiment. I don't think we anticipated that there would be such a proliferation of networks and devices in the system. But now it's time to move over to IPv6.
Thoughts on how you scale the sort of decision-making processes?
Oh boy.
It went from experiment stage to a real thing.
Well, the best way to scale is to remove as many bottlenecks as possible, to have to let 1,000 flowers bloom, and then let competition and not only marketplace competition in a financial sense, but competition of ideas emerge. Since I'm chairman of the board of ICANN, I sit right in the middle of a failure of that process, in a sense of the having a central coordination of the top level of the domain name space, and we're just caught up in a sort of endless set of issues related to the fact that that's a single coordination point, as opposed to if everybody could just do their own. So that's regrettable in the sense that if we had been able to find some other way of having a namespace, that might have been better. But a coordinated namespace serves a very specific and very helpful purpose. So there's a balance between the technical challenges, what you know how to do, versus how far those take you, and what kind of social and governance and related pressures those bring. So scale actually is the watchword. It's the watchword of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, where we both served time and where the internet was born, and it's at the absolute core of what people in our field think about in terms of scaling. And so whenever there's an idea that does not scale, that gets much less attention. The existence of this forum here, the existence of the global IGF and the WSIS process and so forth, is, from an engineering point of view, the manifestation that the engineers didn't figure it out well enough so that the issues that are coming up here didn't occur. And so here we are.
What would you have,
Can I react a little bit to this? In the computer science world, one of the buzzwords is divide and conquer. And often if you have a big problem, you divide it up into smaller problems, and you can solve each smaller problem faster than the bigger one, and then you sort of put all the pieces together. So as an example of a divide and conquer practice on the technical side, standardization, which is what the Internet Engineering Task Force does, has a tremendous scaling function. By agreeing on standards, you wind up avoiding having to have bazillions of bilateral agreements about how you're going to make things work when you interconnect. So adopting standards is a scaling, among its other values, creates a scaling effect. It also creates interoperability, of course, which is very attractive in this environment. There's another example, though, which I think shows that it's hard to scale on certain axes of the Internet's current architecture. One of them is in the domain name space. And even though it's a hierarchical and distributed system, which has allowed it to scale dramatically, our choice of top-level domains has led to a very interesting situation. In the early stages of the domain name space, Postel picked some strings that were not words, .net, well, net is a word, .org, .com, and so on. They were generics. And then we adopted these little two-letter designations for countries. Those largely didn't have heavy semantic value. But then we went off into a space where we expanded the top-level domain space that included things that are words that do have semantic value. Two effects. One of them is that because of the semantics, people care more than they do about strings that are largely symbolic. And the second thing is that there's this trademark problem, and the multiple parties can have access to trademarks, but only one party can have access to a domain name. And so those two are somewhat in conflict with each other. The consequence of that is that it's made it more messy to scale up in that particular space. And I think we're experiencing some of the consequences of that as we walk through this transition from the current operation of IANA and the rest of ICANN and its eventual evolution towards the NTIA release of ICANN's contract. We're seeing a lot of hair showing up, not so much in the technical side with the IETF's tables or with the IP address allocation side, but in the domain name side, I think in part because of the semantic value. I don't know, Steve, whether you have a reaction to that.
I'm going to surprise you. That's a perfect segue into a piece of news that I'm going to share with you hot off the press. I walked into the room a few minutes late at exactly the moment that Secretary Strickling was saying exasperating, and I thought that was sort of the perfect set the perfect tone from my point of view. One of the contentious issues among many contentious issues that we deal with has been what happens when you have competing parties that want the same domain name. And in particular, .Africa has been a subject of a particular contention. Last Friday, an independent review panel, which is fairly high up in the escalation process for adjudicating disputes in our system, issued a report in favor of one of the applicants and took issue with the direction that we had been taking in our evaluation process. The board of ICANN met this very morning, which is what we were doing at 8 o'clock this morning, and we passed a resolution acknowledging the panel's report decision, accepting it and taking action. The primary action is to put the losing the .Connect Africa Trust application back into the evaluation process. And there are other aspects of the panel's decision that we will have to deal with later. This does not represent a final decision about anything. It just moves that process forward. There'll be posting of the resolution and press release probably as we are sitting here. And I thought, your comment about the issues about domain names led perfectly into this. So.
And just sort of taking a step back, that ICANN oversaw the expansion of domain names from these sort of nonsensical strings to
I'm sorry, they weren't nonsensical. They were actually very thoughtfully chosen to parse the space into categories.
Yeah. Were there others on the table at that time?
I'm sorry?
Were there others on the table that
No, this all happened during a period when I was not involved because I went away from the internet thinking I was done and worked on MCI Mail from 83 until 86. So the domain name developed during that period of time. So maybe Steve remembers, but I think John just sort of cooked those 7 domain names up, 8 if you include .arca, that was used as a temporary measure to move hosts from the old host-to-host protocol indicators to the new domain name system. And the top-level country codes, I think, were carefully adopted so that John wouldn't have to decide what's a country. So we went to the ITU in particular and used their identifiers for areas of economic interest, I think was the phrase that was used.
Yeah. So I had bailed out even earlier than Vint, thinking I was done. But John was pretty thoughtful, and he wasn't alone. I'm sure there were others involved, but John was very thoughtful, and there was a very serious attempt at trying not to have the problems that we have today. So there were the 2 classes, basically, country codes, which Vince described, and he dodged the question of having to decide what codes to use for what country by latching on to a previously solved problem, so to speak. And then the other was a a fairly simple and plausible division of the overall set of likely network players. So back in those days, the network was not open for commercial use. It was government and limited kinds of use. So there was a top-level domain for two parts of the U.S. government, .gov and .mil. There was .net for what you would now call ISPs. There was .edu for the universities. There was .org for the nonprofits. And then there was, for the few commercial firms that didn't fit in any of that, there was .com, and that was sort of just an appendage. Well, that appendage obviously grew very large and became dominant. And so it's an example of what happens when you have a certain vision at a certain point in time, and then you move forward a couple of decades, and then you look back and you say, I wonder what we could have done differently about that. I'm not sure that we could have done anything better than that, but there was purposeful, thoughtful, and just not quite sufficient. I wouldn't even say wrong. It just didn't quite get there. And then with the dominance of .com, then comes the pressure of, well, why should they have all of the top-level domains? And so now we're here spending enormous sums, at least seems like enormous sums, and a lot of time on the contention about what other top-level strings. So these problems, you do the best you can at the time, and thoughtfully, and then you find yourself wrestling with them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So how well is that going? The expansion into.
Oh, it's fantastic. No, well, it's going along pretty well. Here's the basic numbers. There was a very long process with some early experiments and then development of processes and principles and so forth that led to a applicant guidebook that was, I think, about that thick.
Yeah.
And then a opening of a window for application processes with a nominal application fee just to cover our costs, a minor cost of $185,000 per application. We estimated 500 applications would come in. 1,930 applications came in. Those numbers multiplied to around $250 million. Unfortunately, interest rates were low at that time. Otherwise, we'd be having a very nice steady stream income from the cash on hand. Of those 1,930, there were clashes for quite a few strings, and I forget the precise number, but a little bit over 1,400 of those strings were distinct from each other, and so the difference between those two numbers represents the collisions, contentions of multiple parties on that. The application process is fairly lengthy and deliberate, weeding out applicants who are not really in a position to do it, applicants who might not be the kind of neighbors that you'd want to have, room for knocking out names that are inappropriate for various reasons, geographic contention, and a variety of other things. So, including visual confusion, which then opens up another huge can of worms. We are, I forget how many are exactly in the set right now, but I think it's somewhere between 1,200 and the 1,400. About half of those have already gone entirely through the process and are delegated and are up in operation. And we're fairly rapidly moving through the rest. I suspect there will be a modest tail of a handful that will take a long time for various reasons, just as sort of normal whenever you have a varied set of applications that you have to deal with. But that process is moving along. Statistics and graphs and all kinds of reports are published on a very regular basis, I think quarterly, and you can dig in and get all the details of that.
So, not to lose your control over this discussion or anything, but I hope that we'll also address broader ranges of things and things that are purely related to ICANN in this discussion.
Is there anything? Really?
Is there anything else other than ICANN?
Well, this is, so as a segue, if you were an engineer or the leader of a sort of tech-focused civil society group in, say, Rio or Cairo or Johannesburg, how well do you think you're plugged into the ability to determine the future of the internet from this point out? And that can be sort of an internet governance question or just a building out the future of the global network.
So my first thought is that it's easier to be involved in the internet if you're already on it. And if you're not, then you have to go get on somehow, and that means somebody has to invest in infrastructure. I would argue that the mobile phones with LTE and IP capability, the smartphones, are an enormous stepping stone for a lot of people to participate in the internet. And I'm not suggesting that you could do a good job of editing IETF standards documents with a mobile. Although some of them are getting kind of big, like the Nexus 6-inch thing. But you do have to have access in order to be engaged. And so this is one area where I'm seeing a great deal of investment going on. We're seeing organizations like the World Bank recognizing that investment in infrastructure that would support internet and other communications capability is just as important as building roads and power generation systems or dams and things like that. So on the whole, I think there's a pretty increasing possibility of engagement. Remember, when this thing started, it was mostly a bunch of American engineers supported by the Defense Department. And today, I think you find a very dramatic variation in the participants. Now, that's on the engineering side. When it comes to policymaking, I think it's been harder. And part of that may be because the people who typically come to policymaking activities are not the engineers. They're people who come out of the Foreign Office, for example. And they find it a little harder to argue that they should go to a private sector meeting, like one of the ICANN meetings, than it is to go to something which is considered part of an recognized international organization. So on the policy side, I think it's harder, but I would argue the engineers are pretty well engaged. I don't know, Steve, do you see anything different from that?
No, I certainly would have to agree with all of that. I'm thinking about Rio and Cairo and so forth. I think, except for the internet, I would not have been to those places, but now I've been to those places more than once. And there's a huge amount of energy locally within each of those environments and many, many others around the world. And so you have the mixture of the technical expansion with local governance issues. Brazil is a beacon of positive activity in their CGI, their internal sort of internal makes it sound small. It's actually not so many people at the very top of it, but as a representation across all of Brazil from all the different sectors, government, academic, and technical, and so forth, and is a model that we think is a pretty good model, and are happy to point to it and hope that other countries adopt similar models in terms of having multi-stakeholder governance locally, and that kind of activity is replicable and scalable, and does make it possible to have participation around the world. The challenges for general participation from everywhere, Vint has alluded to, and Larry Strickling alluded to, it takes a lot of work. It's a lot of energy, travel, and hours spent. Time zones are very difficult problem, and then frankly, facility in English makes a big difference. When you can distribute it across all the different countries, many of those issues melt away, and you have a very vigorous activity. We had pretty good vision of some of the technical things that were going to come forth back in the earliest days. Packet switch voice was one of the earliest experiments, even before 1970, so in the very earliest days. What we didn't set down in our program plans, and I'm being facetious because we didn't set anything down on our program plans like that, is that the definitive implementation of voice over networks would come out of Estonia I don't know how many of us would have been able to find Estonia on the map, actually. So that's the kind of thing that is where the surprise comes from, and it comes because of a very open and very distributed base in which people can jump in from anywhere.
So
Excellent.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry, there's
please.
one other interesting dynamic here which I would like to draw your attention to. The National Science Foundation, starting in the early 1980s, began investing in networking in order to link the academic community together. They started with the computer science community and expanded it beyond that. They developed NSFNet, for example, which is a very significant uh, action because that network was running at 1.5 megabits a second, whereas the original ARPANET was only running at 50 kilobits a second. So it was a big deal. What's interesting is that NSF also invested in connectivity. They paid for lines connecting other research networks around the world into the American research networks, including the ones from NASA and from the Department of Energy, as well as ARPA and NSF. They have continued to do that. And so a lot of the spread of internet has been through the academic path. People learn how to use the internet and implement pieces of it in universities around the world, typically in capital cities or in other major cities. And the people graduate from there and they open up internet cafes and they eventually you see real infrastructure coming. So I think that the US government should get credit for having facilitated the expansion of access to the internet, in addition to, of course, the private sector, which has poured many billions and more dollars into this process than any government that I can think of.
Excellent. So I have one more question, and then I'd love to open it up for folks to ask questions. And I think we need to use a microphone, right? So if people want to line up. So you've both hinted at this. I'd love to just drill down a little bit on it. When you travel the world talking to people about the internet, what works particularly well? Is it, I mean, you mentioned this, getting academics to sort of be at the vanguard seems to work well. Mobile penetration seems to bring people, whether it's technologies, whether it's just, government policies or local culture, what brings people onto the internet to stay, to actively use it in a way that adds value to their lives?
Well, active engagement with others is the essence of it in broad terms. From an academic point of view, people working together in different environments on common problems. So you get science or other kinds of things. And there are an awful lot of projects that are enormously useful that involve people collaborating across the net. That takes you a certain distance, is where we started, and then the explosion comes when you do commerce and you have social processes, and then virtually everybody's engaged in one way or another. And I think people as a whole are much more interested in the social processes, in the commercial activity, and to some extent the scientific activity than they are in governance per se. And the governance then emerges out of that rather than the other way around.
So I agree with that, Steve. I would make two observations. First of all, one of the reasons that the internet has been so attractive to so many people is that it continues to be fairly easy to go build a new application for it. It's an open environment. The standards are open. For the most part, you don't have to make an agreement with every ISP in the world in order to bring up another application. And that aspect of internet openness, I think, has made it easier for people to come up with new ideas. To give you another example of openness, when Tim Berners-Lee did the World Wide Web design, one of the features of his browser and other browsers subsequently is that if you were looking at the web page, you could ask, how did they do that? And you could ask the browser to show you the source code, the HTML. The consequence of that is that everybody learned from everybody else. And so this sharing of information is what triggered the extraordinary explosion of websites around the world, people wanting to share what they knew without necessarily expecting any compensation at all. So openness has been a really powerful tool. I think the other thing which has made the internet such an interesting phenomenon is that the architecture has remained relatively stable. The implementation details have changed, of course, because of higher bandwidth and new kinds of communication media like optical fiber. But the stability of the architecture, I think, has allowed people to rely on the system to behave more or less the way they expect it to. And so what's surprising is the number of applications that are still around that were started very, very early on in the history, even pre-internet. So I want to pick on email just as an example. It comes along around 1971, network email. Ray Tomlinson at Beranek and Newman figures out he can move a file from one machine to another, and he can make it go into somebody's folder on the other machine, which is sort of like, where does your email go? And he's trying to figure out, how do I distinguish the person's folder, account from the host it goes to, and he finds the @ sign is the only symbol on the keyboard that isn't already in use by all the other operating systems. So he picks @ and it sort of had the right, user @ host. So what was interesting about the email, though, is that not long after everybody said, wow, this is a nice application, we started to see mailing lists. And to Steve's point, the first mailing list turned out to be SF lovers, sci-fi lovers. I mean, we're all a bunch of geeks, right? We all read sci-fi books, and we're all exchanging ideas about, this guy is good and this guy isn't. That was a social thing. And it happened very, very early in the history of email. The next one that came up that I can remember was called Yum Yum, and it was a restaurant review in Palo Alto, which eventually expanded to broader geographic territory. Those were two very signal examples of why this system had such a huge social component. And although I don't think we could have predicted all the things that have happened, the fact that there was a social element so early on and so obvious, I think, is just an important factoid.
Let me build on that slightly. Vint mentioned both the addition of new applications and the stability of the network. So that's pointing to two different parts of the architecture. So the basic architecture has a platform of stability, which is built on principally on the IP layer and TCP on top of that, and then a very deliberate openness to add new things on top and to also change the bottom layers as the transmission technologies change. I often talk about three kinds of openness. One is the architectural openness. Another is the openness of participation. Anybody's allowed to come in. You don't have to ask permission. And the other is the openness of the information. The point that Vint made about you can see the HTML source code is part of the much broader texture that you can see what the interfaces are. You can see the documentation. If you want to know, what the documents are, they are documented in RFCs. In contrast, in other settings, you'll be asked if you want to know what the interfaces are, what the protocols are. You'll frequently be faced with, well, why are you asking? Who are you? And it costs you this much to get this documentation, and you have to be part of some organization. That's qualitatively different. My first trip to India in 1994, I went to visit the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, and which incidentally was connected to the U.S. through one of these bilateral arrangements between the U.S. and I don't know whether it's bilateral or not, but it was the Indian Research Network was connected to the American Research Network.
That was ERNet, and okay. Anyway, yes.
Yeah. And after I gave a talk, I was introduced to a graduate student there who had built a very elaborate and very impressive set of applications. And I asked him how he was able to do all that. And he said, well, I just downloaded the documentation and read it. And it was really, quite moving. I was just very impressed, even though it was 20 years or so after we had built the basics and sort of we're just trying to communicate with each other within a very modest set of what seemed like a big set at the time, but a very modest set of American universities and research places.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
Thank you. The conversation on openness really brings us to cybersecurity. And if you guys can comment on how we can keep the open architecture and the beauty of the open structure that you've just discussed and be able to manage the challenges that we're having right now with the cybersecurity challenges on the internet.
So Steve is the expert on this. That's what he did his dissertation work on.
The first thing that I always say when a question like that comes up is that security is a very broad term, and there are many different aspects of cybersecurity. I'm not trying to duck, but I think that a useful discussion has to begin by teasing apart the different problems. So you have, in the news recently, you have some breach of security at the Office of Personnel Management. Is that a cybersecurity issue in terms of the internet, or is that just a management problem of sort of enterprise management problem? And then conversely, you have DDoS attacks, which are an entirely different kind of problem. And so I would counsel the first thing to do is to subdivide the broad terminology into useful areas to discuss, because I think the problems are qualitatively different, and I think that the solutions are quite different. And I'll stop there. It's not really a good place to get into all of that, but it is, to your point, it is quite vital, and we have to understand what we're doing. We have the tension between privacy versus security, and human rights and civil rights versus law enforcement, and a lot of different issues there to sort out, and some non-trivial technical issues like how would you identify somebody? How could somebody authenticate who they are? Which gets into the hairy issues of biometrics and other kinds of technology.
So that was divide and conquer, and in some sense, parsing. And I agree with
Divide
that.
anyway. I don't know about the conquering.
Yeah, right. Fair enough. There are things that are being done and can be done to make the system a lot safer, a lot more secure, and a lot more private. Many of the things that can be done do involve modern cryptography of one kind or another, applications of cryptography, but it has to happen at multiple layers in the architecture. There's no one place that you can introduce this and then say, I'm done. But there's a more fundamental problem. Some of you may have noticed that the Adobe Flash program has been temporarily maybe banned by Mozilla on its browser, Firefox browser, and there are others who are even here at Google. We're sort of being very cautious about that particular program. This is not intended as to poke a sharp stick in the eye of Adobe. These are called zero-day attacks, and they're a consequence of bugs and mistakes that have been made in the implementation, or maybe even in the design of software. The most fundamental problem we have is we don't know how to design software that doesn't have bugs. We just have not figured out how to do that, and that's over 60 or 70 years of sort of trying. The consequence of that is that people will exploit the bugs that they find, and so we're all very excited about open source because you can see what's going on. The trouble with open source is you can see what's going on and exploit things on the basis of what you've discovered. So we have steps. Steve took a very strong initiative on the domain name system to install digitally signed elements in the domain name system in order to protect the integrity of the binding between a domain name and an IP address. And that's been largely successful, although I think we'd like to see more implementation further down the stack. The root is signed for sure, but we'd like to see more. There's still a great deal that can be done and is being done, but this very fundamental problem is still escaping our grasp.
I appreciate the nudge. There's an implicit dialogue going on here. Vin talked about we don't know how to design a secure software. We spend as a community, as an entire population, enormous sums on trying to mitigate the effects of bad software. We spend relatively less money on trying to understand how to build good software in the first place. This is the beginning of a long, passionate speech that I will not give here. We can't do justice to it, and it would be a real burden on you in terms of what you expected to cover here. But I think that it would be possible, should be possible, to have a sea change and to have a very different basis, and that's a mission that I'm committed to as soon as I can sort of get this little ICANN problem under control.
Have you made that speech even in sort of nascent form elsewhere that people can? Look up?
Yes and no. I've made the speech. I don't know how easy it is for people to look up. It will, I expect to be more visible and more active over time.
Okay, excellent.
There's one short speech, if you don't mind my preventing you from asking your question, and that has to do with what's called two-factor authentication. Today, people have usernames and passwords. We all know how bad that is. Two-factor authentication generally requires you to have something in addition to the username and password. At Google, we have little devices that you plug into the USB port that generate cryptographic one-time use passwords. There are other kinds of implementations of that. The whole idea here is to protect yourself from somebody who manages to phish or otherwise discover your username and password to still fail to get access to some destination because that party doesn't have the second factor to protect you. So if you're not using two-factor authentication, you should be complaining, pissing, and moaning about that and asking, how come you weren't?
Excellent.
Your question, sir.
And if I'm sorry, if you can just give your name and if you have a
Yeah, I'm Len
relevant
Hawes.
affiliation.
Len Hawes with the State Department Technology Advisor. First of all, I have to thank both of you for providing a platform for my career for about 35 years. So it continues to be interesting, as you know. My question relates to, and it possibly even ties into your scaling idea. As the internet expands into various sectors and the number of devices is going up exponentially, and we're continuously pushing the policy envelope, if you will, with new ideas and technologies. The role of technologists and policymakers as we're training folks through colleges, you both have transitioned at some point from primary technologists, probably more towards spending a lot more of your time on policy than you ever thought you would have to. Do you think enough's being done to get an earlier start, like maybe an undergraduate level of these various communities, to really push the academic nature of how we understand, whether it's in engineering classes or whether it's in of getting a better basis on this, so we start closing that gap, so that we don't just rely on organically, getting people into these arenas and pulling that stuff together at an earlier phase.
Let me give you a perspective from a technologist's point of view. I sometimes trot out what I call the Oreo cookie model of policy development. So I've had to sit through numerous sessions of people making policy, and so these discussions often go astray. And they go astray for two kinds of reasons from my perspective. They either overreach and say, well, we want this, 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 and this, and it turns out that you can't do all of that. Or they don't see certain possibilities and assume that you can have A or B, but not both, when sometimes you can do better. So you assume a zero-sum game instead of a positive-sum game. So in watching the fine grain of how policies get made, at least in our environment, my thought is have the policy people sort of lay out what it is that they are interested in, then move over and to technical people who can tell you what's feasible and what's not feasible, and sort of lay out the scope, and then turn it back to the policy people to choose where in that space they want to go. The technical stuff, of course, is the sweet filling in the middle of this Oreo cookie model. To your point about education, I think that I haven't gone back to look at what the curriculum is, but it would be interesting for policy people to get an exposure to the technical aspects, and for technical people somewhere along the way to try to understand how policy people frame problems and how to translate those frameworks into the space that they know how to work with, and how to communicate in the other direction, how to the issues that engineering people deal with, technical people deal with, into the policy frameworks. I don't know that I've ever seen a class on the intersection of political science and engineering. It might be kind of fascinating to see what that would be like.
So if I could jump in for a moment, thank you so much for bringing that up. With my former president of the Association for Computing Machinery hat on, we've been pushing very hard to get computer science into the high school curriculum, with equal stature to biology and physics and so on, mathematics. It's still a long slog, but I think it's really important. I think no student should graduate from high school without having some exposure to programming. It's not because I think they should all become programmers. It's because they are going to grow up in a world just as you're in now, surrounded by software. And you should understand both the strength and the weaknesses of software. And so I would like kids to at least have experienced this way of thinking and understand that some software may not work the way they expect it to. If you become a policymaker, if you have a little bit of background like that, at least you'll know enough to say, gee, I should talk to the technical guys because I may not understand in some deep way what's possible and what isn't.
In the back.
Thank you so much. I'm Arsene Tungali and I'm from the Congo. I don't know whether you know where is the Congo, but it is in Africa. I'm glad to be here today. I have a question for both of you. It's really interesting whenever I get the opportunity to listen to you when you talk about the early ages of internet. So I'm very inspired. I was born in 1990, so I'm 25 years old today. I saw a computer for the first time in 2000s. I had my first computer in 2010, and I started using the internet in 2012. No, I mean 2002, sorry. My question to you is this. What do you think I've missed?
That's easy to answer.
And, excuse me, and looking to the future of internet, let's say 50 years from now, what do you think you'll be missing as as the fathers of the internet? Thank you. I don't know whether it's clear.
Well, I get to take the first part of your question. What have you missed? And the answer is you haven't missed anything because the best is yet to come. And then I'll turn it over to Vint about what it is we're going to miss.
50 years. You know, this is 2015. 50 years ago was 1965. I remember that. That was when I graduated from Stanford University and went to work for IBM. I don't think at that point I would have had any clue about what would happen in 2015. That was science fiction, for one thing. I don't think that there is any way to make very good predictions over that long a period of time. It's classic that technologists overestimate what they can do in the short term and underestimate what's possible in the long term, partly because they don't know how to take into account breakthroughs that might happen in the intervening 5 decades. All I can say is that the internet will almost certainly be replaced by something else in 50 years' time, and whatever it is, it'll be better.
Can you define replaced? We're losing the internet?
I'm sorry.
Can you define replaced? I mean, it's sort of a completely different platform.
Let me put it to you this way: it's 1965, or maybe even 1973. I mean, we're doing internet or we're doing ARPANET. What's the primary network that we're all using? It's the telephone system. I mean, before that, it was telegraph. And those of you who haven't read the Victorian Internet should read it. It's Tom Standage, and it's all about the telegraph. And if you read the newspaper reports of how excited people were with telegraph, replace the word telegraph with internet, and you'll see exactly the same thing that got. So we've seen 3 big telecommunications shifts over the last 150 years. We get the 1845 telegraph, and we get 1876, we get the telephone network. 50 years ago, that was the state of the art, the circuit switch telecommunications. Today, we're seeing that entire thing shift over onto the internet. 50 years from now, there may be something else that is richer, more penetrant, and more broadly accessible. We for sure will have satellites, more satellites, maybe even we'll have balloons, maybe we'll have the things that Google is working on or Amazon is working on or the others. There'll just be more access and ability to interconnect and communicate.
Will it be as open? I mean, that's what when you talk about
I
the.
sure as hell hope so.
Okay.
Well,
Are we
look, you know,
trending that way?
John Gilmore, who was one of the founding guys at Sun Microsystems, had this great quote. He said, "The internet detects censorship as damage and routes around it." And I hope that that's going to be true in the future. Whatever it is, whatever gets implemented or designed, I hope it's as open and accessible to people so they can build their pieces of it. I would hope that we have this continued, very distributed ability to engage in building and operating pieces of whatever succeeds the internet. I hope we can hang on to that. It's a really important principle.
Excellent. And just a housekeeping note, we're going to keep going until 11, if that's okay with everyone?
Whatever that is,
Okay.
yeah.
It's about
Okay.
half an hour more. Excellent. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Susan Chalmers. Flowing on from that question, I'd like to know your thoughts on software-defined networking and how that might be a game changer for the internet going forward.
SDN.
SDN.
SDN. Oh, software-defined networks. Okay. So first of all, I find the term SDN sort of weird because it's all software and it always has been software and it wasn't anything other than software. If anything, it started as software and then it moved into hardware because you project some of the software into the hardware. But I think your intent is to say, well, what about the things which have emerged with that label, like OpenFlow? A very interesting design that came out of Stanford University and was funded by the National Science Foundation as part of the Future of Internet Design Project. What was particularly interesting about that design is two things. First of all, they removed the control plane from the data plane in order to increase the safety of the system and limit the attack vectors or attack surface that would interfere with network control. The second thing was to decide that the decision for how to route traffic should not be exclusively confined to the address bits of the packet. And in fact, what would happen if instead of using addresses as a way of saying where something was supposed to go, what if you used other bits in the packet that describe the content of the packet? So now we're getting into content-based networking. There's a lot of interest in that. I'm still kind of on the fence with regard to how well that scales. But the basic idea behind that one is that if you say, this is the kind of information I'm interested in, and the routing table will route things that say, I'm this kind of information to you and to anybody else who said I'm interested in that. So there's a richness in the network architectures that are starting to emerge, partly out of the fact that memory is cheap and machines are running faster and you can get away with things now that you couldn't before. And so I'm glad you asked that because it's evidence that there's still a lot of room for exploration of ideas for doing networking differently.
Do you have a take on that?
I'm not, that's sufficient, I think.
Okay. Who's first? Yeah.
My name is Ali Akbar Musavi. I'm Iranian, an advocate for internet freedom here in the United States since 2009. So I don't know. My question is about one world, one internet, the term that usually you are using. As you know, China and then Iran are trying to build their own internet. In my country, sometimes they say halal internet, intranet, or national internet, something like many different names. But fortunately, recently, Mr. Shahada from ICANN announced that officially that we got an agreement with Chinese in that regard, that they are going to follow this kind of term that one internet in the world we have also in China. My question is that what happened for that agreement? Did you follow that type of engagement or discussion with Iranian government, especially recently that you know that 2 days ago we got a good agreement between Iran and other countries? And technically my question is from Mr. Cerf, how that is possible, this dream that some Iranians I hope that you could travel to Iran and talk directly to Iranians in my country and explain to them technically It's very important. Thank you. And also, I would like to thank ICANN because of the court case that in Washington, D.C. Last year, they tried to freeze the internet asset of whole Iran, I mean, but you rejected. I would like to thank you about this issue as well. Thank you.
So, several thoughts. First of all, I think the Iranian situation and the Chinese situation are a little different. And of course, the Iranian situation may change as a consequence of the recent decisions that have been taken. You can always implement internet wrong. In other words, you can do things which are not part of the standard. You can deliberately mess things up. And in China, for example, they are going out of the way to prevent you from resolving certain domain names and making connections in the network. I was there and had a lot of trouble getting to my email because Google is not welcome there. So it's possible to deliberately violate what would normally be considered proper practice and correct operation. There's nothing you can do about that. There's nothing stopping somebody from deliberately building a router which filters out certain addresses and interferes with domain name resolution. The Chinese situation is very interesting because they have 650 million Chinese online right now. And that means they've invested a great deal of time, energy, money, and resource to build a piece of internet. And I think, to be quite honest with you, that over time, they will discover that trying to build this firewall around the country will interfere with their ability to engage fully in the world commerce. And since that's really important to them, eventually that, I think, will become apparent. The other thing that may happen is that there will be an increasing comfort level with people being more open about what they care about and what complaints they have. I can tell you that having visited China now for about 20 years, off and on, that the conversations I've had with Chinese citizens in the recent past, like several months ago, are quite different from the ones I had 20 years ago. They are far more open about criticizing than they ever would have been before. The Iranian situation is different because there's a real attempt to completely isolate themselves from the rest of the net. Again, I can't say exactly what's going to happen as a result of this recent agreement and the removal, ultimately, of the various constraints. Personally, I'm hoping that all countries will figure out that it's more important to be part of the global community than it is to isolate yourself from it. Now, the North Koreans, I don't know what to say about.
Right. Excuse me. Jeremy Pesner, U.S. General Services Administration. I'd like to echo the previous sentiment, thanking you for providing basically a career path for me, not just because of the work that you did, but because of the talk you gave to my undergrad institution, which first exposed me to this world of tech policy, which ever since I've found to be much better suited for my interests and skill sets than being a traditional software developer. So I actually rolled around in my head which question I thought I'd ask. Would it be a more technical one or a broader social one? Decided I'd go with the latter, mix things up. I've noticed in my subsequent years in really becoming involved in the Internet Society and other relevant policy communities how small it is, for various reasons, I guess, because of people who have the dual interests in technology and policy. So I suppose I have a two-part question. Do you personally believe that this community should be larger to encompass more people, more technologists who might not be interested in policy, or more policy people who don't, quite understand work with the internet the way that we do? So that would be my first question: whether you think it should be expanded, and then the second one would be, if so, how? What would we say to people in these categories who don't necessarily see the issues we discuss and the work we do as relevant to their interests?
I'm going to toss it to Vint after I say just a word or two. The way you phrased the question, I just want to share sort of what goes through my mind as I listen to that. You say, well, it's small, and so maybe we should expand it. And the first thing I do is I think in terms of, well, so this is a scaling issue, and you're talking about right sizing. What are the limits on this? How small is too small? How big would be too big? It's easy to imagine that you get everybody involved, and then it's 100% overhead and no useful work gets done, right? So you don't want to make it too big, and on the other hand, if you make it too small, then it gets constricted. So it's interesting to try to find what the balancing forces are as to how you would choose the right size for that. That doesn't give you the answer that you're looking for, but I just wanted to share sort of the way I processed your question as it came in, and then I'll turn it over to Vin to give you a real answer.
Optimization question, I understand.
So actually, the seeds of answer might be found in the following phenomenon. We do the World Summit on the Information Society. There's all this tension about what's an information society, and everybody points at the internet. Then they point at ICANN, and then we have this Working Group on Internet Governance, which doesn't quite come to a conclusion and leads to the Internet Governance Forum. What happens after that is really interesting because you see a spontaneous growth of national or regional internet governance meetings. They were not created by the United Nations or by the ITU or anybody else. They were spontaneous and they were bottom up. So what this suggests to me is that some of the scaling question will be dealt with by exactly that phenomenon. Groups of people deciding they have common interests in wanting to debate issues. Now, on the tension between policy and engineering, engineering is often easier than policy, and the reason for this is that at least you have some concrete ability to assess how well this design works versus that design. You have some concrete measures. You might implement something and test it and see what you can learn from that. On the policy side, it's harder because it's heavily associated with opinion and judgment and trying to anticipate the implication of choosing a particular policy. Here's where the two communities can really help each other out. The technical guys can help the policy guy figure out whether or not it's possible to achieve a particular objective from the technical point of view. The policy guy may be able to help the engineer figure out what are the social and economic implications of choosing a particular design or another. Now, I will tell you that my ability to figure out what the social and economic implications of various choices are is very weak. I had not anticipated the side effect of charging people for domain names. I mean, it was a very rational decision. The NSF was paying for the domain name system to be operated, and it said, why am I spending research dollars on something which is becoming increasingly commercial? So it seemed perfectly reasonable to say, well, why don't you make the system self-sustaining? You do that by charging people. The side effect of this is twofold. One, of course, is all the complexity that we talked about earlier today, but there's also something that caused the domain name system and the identification system of the internet to fragment. I mean by this that if you have a domain name and you associate web pages with it, for example, and that domain name goes away because you forgot to pay your annual fee, all the things that were pointed to by URLs suddenly don't work anymore. And so we have this fabric which is now brittle because of a charging system that we put in place for perfectly good reasons. And so there's an example of a policy outcome that wasn't obvious to me anyway. It might have been obvious to other people. So this is a place where we need to help each other out.
Thank you.
First,
Hi, I'm Norman from Tech Change. I also want to echo the thank you for this talk and everything. And I realize my question is actually a little similar to the question about sort of one internet and one world. I'm perhaps a little more interested on the sort of governance side, where it seems to me that there are issues both on being sort of too open and sort of too closed. You have things like mesh networks, where people fear some of the regulations to try to localize sort of content in the internet. And so I'm really interested in how governance, sort of some of these issues like sort of censorship and localization will work sort of going forward with the future of the internet. Will this perhaps lead to separate systems, or do you think that those would try to come together and merge, and do you think the internet, especially as technology changes, will sort of remain the one holistic internet that it is?
There's always tension. Anytime you attempt to impose censorship, there's going to be back pressure. Any of you who know the history of the Soviet Union will remember the samizdat, which were essentially carbon copies of things that were passed around surreptitiously to get around the fact that the government didn't want certain people to see certain things. My guess is that no matter what you try to do on the censorship side, there will be technical attempts to bypass that. It's very common in China for people to use virtual private network tunnels to get out of China, and they're discovered. The tunnels are shut down, and they open up new ones. It's whack-a-mole. So I am persuaded that in the long run, openness and freedom of expression is inescapably going to win, although not every time. There will be successful suppression, but it won't be uniformly successful over the long run.
So is the idea then, if the internet remains open, then theoretically, the will to have everything be part of the same system would prevail?
I don't think that it's trying to separate this into multiple systems. This is fragmentation. And, frankly, the original design of the internet was that everything should be able to talk to everything else. We didn't have firewalls. We had none of that. And it was only when the internet started showing up in enterprise situations where you had a company that had a bunch of computers and they didn't want somebody from outside getting access to those computers that this firewall notion started to pop up. It was an enterprise notion. In the academic community, of course, you wanted to communicate with everybody. That was the whole idea. That's why the network was built in the first place. So you discover that in different contexts, you wind up wanting to protect things in various and sundry ways. With the Internet of Things coming, I think we're going to shift back to a somewhat different environment where every device has got to figure out how to defend itself. And it's going to have to decide, do I really want to talk to this other thing that's trying to communicate with me? So we're going to have to design a way for these little edge devices to decide, should I or should I not engage in the conversation? And it's got to be a fairly strong authentication mechanism. You don't want some random guy controlling your heating, ventilation, air conditioning, or your security system. And so I think we're going to find ourselves pushing in the other direction now, where every device has to be carefully crafted to make sure it only talks to things that it's supposed to talk to.
Thank you.
Back there.
Oh, somebody's keeping track of time, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, okay.
It's 10:45.
Hi, Benny.
Hi, Vint. Happy to see that you're feeling better today than yesterday. Vint was pretty sick, and that's the first time I've seen him sick in 20 years. So I was really worried, but now I'm fine.
Thank you.
I'm Benny Markowski. I'm ICANN's Vice President for UN Engagement based in New York. And both of you talked about these abbreviations, WSIS and IGF and WGIG and stuff like that. But what I really think, and I'm sitting next to a diplomat from the UN in this session, and I'm really fascinated by the way you presented the history of the internet, and thank Nancy for all the early questions which kind of brought the discussion into place. Do you think that at some point you might consider talking to the UN diplomats? Because this is some of the things that they really need to hear, like why the internet is what it is today, and why the design was intended to actually you just said no firewalls, everything should talk to everything.
So I have a set of slides which probably date back to 1997, maybe even a little before that, called Internet 101, which I used to present to a number of diplomats at the United Nations. And so the answer is, if you thought that was a useful thing to do, I imagine several of us could be persuaded to do that again.
Yeah, thank you. I will work on that. Thanks.
I'm sort of shocked to hear those conversations aren't taking place. I mean, whether or not you're participating in them, but the diplomats would need to be.
I think they are. The UN is. I'm not an expert on the UN, but it's a multifaceted, complicated organization, and I think there's lots and lots of interactions. Whether or not they're getting to the effect that Benny wants to is thinking about is probably another question. But, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Ashley Baer. I'm from the State Department, the Office of Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary. And I wanted to follow up on your comment about incorporating computer programming into high school all the way through, just like reading, writing, and math, because it's such a big part of our world right now. And it got me thinking about stakeholders and groups that we know are really underrepresented in these fields in computer programming, such as women and certain minority groups. And I was wondering if you've been involved at all in thinking about how we can make headway on improving inclusiveness.
Oh, I missed the tail end of your question. Your voice tailed off a little bit, and my hearing is no longer, well, it never was very good. But anyway, just repeat the tail. Make progress on what?
Improving inclusiveness. Inclusivity of groups that are currently underrepresented in the field of computer programming, as valuable stakeholders that, unless they have a role in participating in these parts of our world, their representation won't be counted.
Let me just pick one portion of that sort of broad space. There's been over the years a lot of focus in the computer science education community, a question about gender balance, about women participating. There's some first-class work at Carnegie Mellon University, and I think in collaboration with Harvard and others, on trying to understand what the barriers were in practice for women in computer science, and some modifications to the curriculum and to the admission process, specifically aimed at trying to overcome those things. It's not there's not just one single variable involved. There's a lot of different variables involved. So you can fix some of those things, and then others are tied to much bigger issues about the kinds of choices that people make and the peer groups make and so forth. But nonetheless, I think it's been very active and to the extent that it's possible, successful at opening those things up. I know from perspective of women that we men get looked at as if we're clueless and have no idea. But I can tell you personally that for a very long time, I'm used to walking into a room and doing a quick look to see what the gender balance is. And in highly technical areas, I found, this is just a personal anecdotal, not a researched and validated statistic, but I found as you go down the stack toward the hardware, it becomes more male dominated. As you move up the stack toward applications, and it becomes much more participation by women. And on the other hand, there are some brilliant hardware designers who are women. So it's not, there's no formal barrier there. It's just an observation as well. But there is a very high degree of sensitivity, even from those of us that you would hardly expect to be sensitized to that. Being sensitized is one thing; being able to do anything about it is another.
So actually, there's some good news on the horizon. Let me explain. I've been watching the science and engineering indicator reports coming out of the National Science Board, which oversees the National Science Foundation. And one of the things that they put into the 2014 report, which will no doubt be repeated in the 2016 report, is to show what degrees people got and then what jobs they ended up in. And often it is not, the degree you got is not specifically what you end up working in. And what I found really interesting is that there is a very, very strong trend towards women getting into biology, biotechnology, things along those lines, chemistry. And it turns out that increasingly all of those sciences require or rely on increasing amounts of computing capability. In fact, the last 3 Nobel Prizes in chemistry were for dry chemistry. It was for algorithms for doing simulations at the molecular level of interactions. So I think in the long term, we're going to find this gender balance shifting out of necessity, because the women who are interested in the biosciences are going to wind up also having to make heavy use of programs and computing and the like. In the short term, I think we need to do very specific things in order to make the computer science world more friendly, and I mean that in the most literal sense possible. So here's what I learned at West Point. I talked to the woman who is running the computer science department there, and she said to me that she would not teach a computer science class unless, if there were any women in it, they had to be at least 3. And 3 turned out to be the magic number. And the reason, quite bluntly, is that if you're trying to defend yourself from a bunch of males full of hormones and whatever, it's really hard. But if somebody else defends you, it's different. It's just socially different. And so by having at least 3 women in the class, she said it changed the whole tenor of the class. So I'm not trying to say this is a trivial way of solving all the problem, but recognizing things like that is really important. So I'm hoping to spread please take that and make use of that little, idea if you happen to be teaching classes.
Thank you very much.
So we have about 8 minutes left, so maybe we
Okay,
do them a little bit quicker.
Klaus Stoll, Global Knowledge Partnership Foundation and Pathfinder. I have a very straightforward question. The internet is becoming bigger and bigger and more significant for everybody. And the internet, we are trying to get people on the internet. We are talking about the next billion. But for me, the internet is like a country where 99.9% of the population don't even know that the government exists. And we are here in the Internet Government Forum, and I think it's very, the question is twofold. Don't you think this is a dangerous situation? Isn't it dangerous for the internet itself that most of the users don't even know about the governments, let alone being involved? And if that is the case, what can we do about getting the 99.9% aware about what's going on?
I didn't hear all of that. So,
if I got the gist of the question, we have a very large number of people using the internet, and the framework of the question is think of it as a country.
Oh.
And so only a very small fraction, a tiny fraction of the population of this country is involved in the governance of this country. Isn't that a dangerous situation? Is that the thrust of your question?
Yes, and if you think it is dangerous, what can we do to get more people involved?
So let me draw attention to the fact that almost all governance involves a small number of people compared to the rest of the population, because on the whole, the rest of the population doesn't care as long as they don't feel like their lives are being harmed. There is one other thing, though, to keep in mind, and it's related to your point. Often, what Larry Strickling and others have articulated is that the multi-stakeholder model of governance is an important one because it allows multiple parties to involve in policy development. But policy enforcement does not necessarily involve all the people who do the policy development. So that's a very important distinction in my view. Once you establish policy, you may still have a very small subset of the population involved in its implementation. Now, actually, since you brought up this analogy of the internet being a country, I always thought it ought to be a monarchy. And I thought that would just solve the problem.
With who at the top?
Exactly.
Which one of you?
My name is Courtney Raj. I'm the Advocacy Director at the Committee to Protect Journalists and an academic member of GigaNet. And first off, I'm glad to hear you say that internet governance is more than just IANA or the technical infrastructure. I think that what is very clear is that many people who are not, very involved in internet governance perceive it as broadly including national laws as well as, internet governance structures. And, I know that you are optimistic about the future of freedom of expression, but I wonder, with these type of rulings coming out of the European Union, with the right to be forgotten, with increasingly insidious forms that aren't just blunt blocking of URLs, but the manipulation of information, really insidious hacking and taking over of, computers and the manipulation of the technology that people are using. And then also the UN. So I used to work for UNESCO, and they're very interested in, having a role in internet governance, and just means everyone wants to have a piece of this. And when we talk about multi-stakeholderism, which I think it is becoming an ism, unfortunately, there's this idea that is a panacea to everything, but stakeholders like civil society or journalists or activists often aren't as empowered. They don't have the same resources as companies. They don't have the time that others have, et cetera. So, given this complex mix, do you still feel that, optimistic about the future? And then also, what can we do to, think about governance structures that don't simply say, okay, multi-stakeholder is the answer?
So my answer is I'm still very optimistic about this, and I think part of the reason is that although it's true that activists and others don't necessarily have the same resources, the internet itself gives them resource that they wouldn't normally have. Those voices that would normally be essentially unheard are getting more visible and more audible. If you look at social networking and see what the impacts have been, it's pretty impressive. Now, at the same time, I think it's very important to recognize that social activism doesn't necessarily produce a result that you will be happy with. To give you a concrete example of that, look at Tunisia and Egypt and some of the other, Arab Spring countries that have had many ups and downs and reversals, despite the fact that there was this great feeling of power that, we deposed an administration that we didn't like. And, so, are we proud of ourselves and look how great social networking was? And then in the end, other things happened that hadn't been anticipated. Nonetheless, in spite of all of that, I still see so much ability to use this infrastructure to articulate issues that I'm not willing to be despondent about some of the outcomes. I'm still very positive. I don't know how Steve feels about that.
No, I'm not going to add to that. You've said it all.
Excellent. So we are out of time, but I do want to ask one question if I can ask you to respond very briefly. If you walk down the street, we're on campus at GW here, you're going to see everyone on their cell phone online, everyone on their laptop sitting in their quad online. How does that feel, knowing that you built that thing that's connecting the world?
Well, I didn't invent the mobile, or that. In fact, my good friend Marty Cooper invented the mobile.
Magic inside.
No, I think. Well, look, this is a tool. It's sort of like a road system. I'll tell you how I avoid culpability. I think of this as having designed a road system, and other people design the cars, and other people will design the build and decide where to put buildings on the side of the road system. So I don't want to take responsibility for everything everybody does on the net. You learn this very early on if you have kids. You don't take, you learn not to take too much credit when they do well, so you don't have to take too much blame when they don't do well. So, I'll take some credit for having figured out how to make the road system work, but everybody else is responsible for drunk driving and, building shoddy buildings.
Let me echo that. It's a question that does, in fact, come up both from inner thoughts and from people asking that sort of question. My personal reaction is a similar sort of detachment of feeling less responsible, both for the blame and the credit, but more a sense of real excitement and privilege for having been able to see from a front row seat, so to speak, all that development and to be participating. So it's been an extraordinary ride, but it stopped short in a very firm way, exactly the way it's been described, of saying, well, I did this, or everybody owes me any kind of thing. That's just not where it is. But it has been a really quite exciting ride, and I look at my children and think about what experiences they're going to have and whether or not they're going to have, in their own ways, similar kinds of experiences. I hope they do.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. This has been great. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.